Well, good morning. I hope today finds you well and staying safe. We continue our studies this morning in Mark as we turn to verse 23 of chapter 2. That's Mark 2, verse 23, and we're going to read through until verse 6 of chapter 3. So I'll give you a moment to pause and look up those verses of Mark 2, verses 23 to verse 6 of chapter 3. And as you've read those verses, I hope you were struck especially by verses 27 and 28 of chapter 2, where Jesus is speaking and he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Obviously today we're going to be looking at our Sundays and how we spend them. And I wonder, how do you spend your Sundays? Up until very recently, Sundays for us as a family went by in a flash. No sooner had we woken up and had breakfast than we had to get into that mad rush of getting the boys ready, getting ourselves ready, and getting off to Sunday school. There was those few moments of calm over a cup of coffee before the service, and then we gathered together with great joy, but also sometimes quite stressfully, trying to help our young boys engage with worship and understand what's going on. And then there's the mad dash home to get lunch and then to get ready to get out again for evening worship and youth fellowship. On many Sundays until recently, it seemed like the term day of rest was more a lofty ambition than a gracious invitation. However, during these days of lockdown, things have changed. Many things have changed for us as people, and for us as believers, our Sundays have changed dramatically. With the usual habits suspended for now, it may leave many of us wondering, how should we spend our Sundays, especially with all this extra time? Now, I know there's a great debate around the fourth commandment and what it means to keep the Sabbath holy. I'm not going to address that debate directly today for two valid reasons. Firstly, I believe it's up to each believer to look at what that looks like in their context and in their own lives personally. And secondly, this is not the central concern of our passage today. Here, Mark is again addressing the issue of Christ's authority and how that produces conflict with his enemies as their expectations are superseded by Christ's mission. However, in the midst of our passage, we do learn a key principle which should help us as we seek to honour God and how we use our Sabbath days and keep them holy. In Jesus' words and deeds, we learn the Sabbath is graciously given by the Lord of the Sabbath to bless his people and bring glory to his name. Our passage today begins with a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees over what is lawful on the Sabbath. And without going into the details, what we see here is the Pharisees trying to defend and impose their man-made rules, their religious rules about Sabbath observance. In response, Jesus calls out their religious formalism and their misplaced concern for external observance rather than internal holiness. These men were more concerned with their traditions and their ceremonies than with true holiness that glorifies God. In referring to David's use of the holy bread, Jesus was teaching that human need is more important than religious ritual. The Sabbath was given by God for man's benefit, for the good of his body, mind, and soul. It was a gracious gift of God given as a blessing to be enjoyed responsibly, not a burden to be begrudgingly observed. We see in Jesus' words and deeds in this passage that the Sabbath is an invitation to believers to come and rest in his presence and to have their deepest needs satisfied in him and him alone. Ultimately, the Sabbath is a foretaste of the eternal rest that we will enjoy forever in God's presence when we come to Christ in faith. So, as grace-bought followers of Jesus, we are not to spend our Sundays in thoughtless, heartless, burdensome religious observance. Instead, our Sundays are to be spent pursuing soul restoration and deepened relationship with God as we set aside time to be with him and to be with his people. As believers, our delight and our duty is to begin a new week in God's presence as we gather as God's people to worship in spirit and in truth. Sundays should be marked by a pursuit of joy in Christ that sets us up for the rest of our week as we worship and serve our great God together and individually. So in our passage we see that Christ displayed that the Sabbath was given by God for the benefit of his people. And because God gave it as a gracious gift, then he alone determines how it should be observed. So in verse 28, we see Jesus declare that the Lord of the Sabbath alone can judge what is appropriate for Sabbath observance. This means that if we want to know how best to spend our Sundays, then we must consider how Jesus spent his Sabbaths. And so in verses 1 to 6 of chapter 3, we see Jesus display how Sundays should be filled with God and with godly acts. Serving others, doing good things, doing what is necessary to help those in need, sharing the love of God with those who need it most. In these verses, Mark emphasizes that Jesus comes into conflict with these religious leaders, not because he healed a man's withered hand, but because he did it on the Sabbath. In this interaction with the religious leaders, Jesus was teaching his followers and us today that observing the Sabbath is more than just about avoiding certain activities. Instead, we learn that spending our Sundays properly and profitably are about filling them with all kinds of good things, bringing joy and life to ourselves and to others. Sundays are to be days of joy and soul restoration. Sundays should be life-giving experiences as we set aside time to meet with the Lord and with his people in deep and meaningful ways. Our Sundays should be spent deepening our love for the Lord and learning to love others in response to the love that we experience. In these unusual days, let us spend the extra time they afford to reflect on how we can use our Sundays as a gift to be enjoyed and an opportunity to glorify the Lord of the Sabbath. Each Sunday, let us remember that this is a day that the Lord has made, the day in which the Lord rose again, the day he gives us to rejoice and be glad that we are his people. I pray that this would be how we spend our future Sundays. God bless.